good evening or good afternoon or 2 a.m. because you couldn't sleep and started doom scrolling. Wherever you're joining from, welcome back to Borderlines, and I promise you this one is worth staying awake for because we are talking about a number today that should, by any normal political logic, be setting off alarms in the West Wing louder than the ones that go off when someone mentions the ballroom budget. 37.5%. That is roughly where President Trump's approval rating on the economy now sits, according to the polling averages as of this month. And if that number sounds familiar, it should, because it is lower than his own first term ever managed, and it is lower than the number that historically precedes what political scientists politely call a wave election, and everyone else calls a bloodbath. Now, I want to be careful here, because numbers like this get thrown around so often they stop meaning anything. So let's actually sit with what happened, why it happened, and this is the part nobody wants to talk about. What it is going to cost, specifically the party that currently controls the House, the Senate, and the presidency, which is to say the party that no longer has anyone left to blame. Here's the shape of it. Trump came into this year around 47% approval, a normal inauguration bump, nothing unusual. Then it just eroded down to 41 in March, a brief flicker back up to 43 in April, the kind of number that makes a White House communications team start drafting comeback narratives. And then May happened, and it fell to 38.1, the lowest of either term, and it has not meaningfully recovered since. Independents, the group that actually decides elections because the base is going to approve of him at 87%, no matter what happens short of an asteroid strike, are sitting at 34%. And I want you to remember that number, because the last time independent approval dropped below 36% heading into a midterm, Republicans lost 41 House seats in a single night. 34 is worse than that. So, what happened? Well, of course, there was a war. The United States and Israel struck Iran, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz for the better part of 3.5 months, and this is the part that I think gets lost. That is not a small waterway. That is the pipe through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas physically travels. Close it, and you are not causing a regional problem, you are causing a global one. And Americans do not experience global problems as headlines. They experience them as the number on the sign at the gas station. Prices spiked to $4.50, $4.56 a gallon in some tracking, the highest in over 3 years. And then, in mid-June, the U.S. and Iran signed what both sides very carefully called a Memorandum of Understanding, not a peace treaty, not a deal. A memorandum, which is diplomatic language for, we have agreed to stop shooting at each other while we figure out if we actually agree on anything else. The president told reporters prices would, quote, drop like a rock. Prices did in fact drop, down to around $3.99, then further toward the high threes. Just not like a rock. More like a feather, which is, incidentally, the exact phrase energy analysts use for this pattern, and they use it because it happens every single time. Prices spike like a rocket and fall like a feather, and there are more than 500 vessels still sitting outside a strait that may or may not be fully cleared of mines, and refineries across the Gulf that took direct damage and are not back to full production, and shipping insurers who are, understandably, in no rush to bet a $100 million tanker on a memorandum. So, relief is coming. It is just coming on the timeline of sometime next year, not the timeline of in time for the summer road trip. And 45% of Americans have already told pollsters they are skipping that road trip because of cost. That is the gap between the announcement and the actual experience of being an American with a car and a budget. And that gap is where the approval numbers are currently living. Now, you would think, given all of that the administration's political strategy would be relentless message discipline on cost of living. And in fact, that appears to have literally been the plan. There is a reporting detail from a staff meeting that I keep coming back to, where the chief of staff reportedly told the room the strategy going forward: let Trump be Trump and have everyone else hammer affordability, which is, on paper, not a bad plan, coherent even. The problem, and I say this with real affection for whoever had to sit in that meeting and nod, is that it requires the President of the United States to stay on message, and asking this particular president to stay on message is a little like asking the tide to stay out. It comes in, it always comes in. An event gets scheduled to talk about grocery prices, and somehow, by the end of it, everyone is discussing the White House ballroom renovation again, A project which, for the record, roughly 60% of voters oppose, and which involves something like $1 billion in taxpayer money for security upgrades alone. So, the affordability message gets drowned out by its own author week after week, and the Democrats, who are not exactly known for their message discipline either, have stumbled into being, for now, the more trusted party on the economy, mostly by the extremely difficult strategy of showing up and pointing at the receipts. And here's where it stops being a poll number and starts being a structural problem for one specific party. Because it isn't just approval eroding quietly at the edges, it's erupting publicly inside the Republican conference itself. Senate Republicans openly criticized the Iran memorandum the same week the president effectively blindsided them by pulling his own nominee for Director of National Intelligence hours before a scheduled confirmation hearing, and then demanded they attach a stalled election bill, one that does not currently have the votes to pass anything, onto a surveillance reauthorization that actually needs to move, which put the Senate Majority Leader in the position every Majority Leader dreads: publicly loyal, privately furious, and functionally unable to do anything about either. Because doing something about it would mean touching the filibuster. And there are members of his own conference who like the filibuster precisely because it's the one thing left that makes the Senate feel like the Senate and not an annex of the West Wing. So nothing moves. The tension sits there, visible to anyone paying attention, and gets carefully not discussed by anyone whose job depends on the president's mood. And this is the part I think actually matters more than any single poll, because redistricting has quietly made most of this arithmetic much less forgiving than it used to be. There aren't 60-seat swing elections anymore. There aren't even 26-seat ones. The generic ballot right now shows Democrats up by roughly 7 points. And because of how thin the competitive map has become, a swing of just 7 seats is enough to flip control of the House. 7, not 40, 7. Which means a president who is underwater by 18, 20, in some polls 30 points, doesn't need to cause a landslide to cost his party the majority. He just needs to keep doing exactly what he's already doing, at exactly the pace he's already doing it, for about 4 more months. And nothing in the behavior we've seen this year suggests that pace is changing. So, will any of this reverse by November? Some of it, probably. Gas prices will keep drifting down, slowly, unevenly, in the way oil markets always do after a shock. Not because anyone fixed anything, but because global supply eventually catches up to demand, the way it always does, on its own schedule, indifferent to anyone's electoral calendar. The war will keep being described in official language as over, even on days when it doesn't entirely feel over. What is much harder to walk back is the trust that gets spent once voters conclude that the person driving the car does not particularly care whether the car is heading toward a cliff. You can lower the price of gas. It is considerably more difficult to lower the price of having watched it happen. The White House spent the first half of this year building a highly disciplined communications plan to convince Americans the economy was improving, and then spent the second half of it accidentally demonstrating, in real time, exactly why that plan wasn't going to work. You almost have to admire the completeness of it. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines. If you'd rather understand what's actually happening, then wait for someone to explain it to you after it's already happened. You know what to do. See you in the next one.